do with purpose and meaning and God, you will grow closer to Him personally. Takes some work, takes some concentration, but it's immensely important. Take a look at verse 8. The Lord called Samuel a third time. Samuel got up, went to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." And Eli realized the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Okay, go lie down. And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at other times, "Samuel! Samuel!" Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." So the third thing I would say is this. Don't expect God to call you in the same way that He's called everyone else. Okay? Or call you in the way that you've heard that God calls people. Or expect that, in the more positive, expect that God will speak to you personally, and don't wait for God to speak to you in a way that He speaks to other people. Okay? He's very creative. And He speaks a lot of different ways. To Abraham, He appeared as a traveler. To Moses, it was a burning bush. To Isaiah, he saw a vision of God seated on the throne of the tabernacle, the throne of the universe. His train was in the temple, and it terrified him. Isaiah, or Jesus, God came down in the form of a dove. John, he wrote the book of Revelation. He saw Jesus standing with a face shining brighter than the sun, and it almost killed him. So it seems that God doesn't have a standard way that He talks to people. Samuel, he heard God's voice in such an ordinary way that he thought it was Eli talking to him in the next room. Everyone who's met God, everyone who I've talked to about them meeting God, says they have a different spin. They've all got a different spin onto how God spoke to them, or got them, or grabbed their heart, or changed their mind, or whatever they say, brought them to salvation, how God speaks to them. Now you might ask, does God speak to me personally? I'm glad you asked. Yes, He does. The most common way that God speaks to me is through the Bible. I would say this is the most common way He speaks to most people today. The book that we study, this Bible, is the written words of God. It has everything we need to understand God, salvation, life, death, most of the stuff in between. Someone said that 95% of what we need to know about the will of God is written in the Bible. We tend to dwell on the other 5%. Sometimes I have a situation in my life that I don't understand. I need comfort, or I need direction. And I'll be reading the Bible, and a verse will basically jump off the page. You ever had that eye test where they put the glasses on and all of a sudden everything's like sticking out? Right? That does that to the Bible. It happened to me the other night, actually. I had a very difficult day. A lot of physical pain, a lot of emotional pain, a lot of spiritual attacks. I just felt like a complete failure. I was wiped out. I was done. But as I almost always do, before I went to bed, I grabbed my Bible and I opened it up to where I was. Right now I'm in the book of Proverbs. I had about 3 or 4 chapters worth. I've already been reading 3 or 4 chapters, and I came across Proverbs 18:14. A man's spirit sustains him in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear? A man's spirit sustains him in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear? And I read that, and it just went 3D on me. And I just felt God say to me, "You know what, Al? I know how you feel." And that was the whole message. That's how I felt. I wished I was physically sick. But I felt my very spirit was crushed. And I couldn't bear it anymore. And I stared at that verse for about 5 minutes, just reading it over and over and over, and hearing the same phrase from God. "You know what, Al? I know how you feel." And in that phrase, there was a lot of promises that I've learned from God over the years. "Al, you're not alone. I'm here with you. I've been through something like this before. I've taken you through things like this before. And as I've meditated on it a bit, 2 Corinthians 4 comes to mind. And it says, we are pressed on every side but not crushed. Perplexed but not in despair. Persecuted but not abandoned. Struck down but not destroyed. I think God spoke to me that night right before bed, and I had a good sleep. And it meant a lot for Him just to say to me, you know what, Al? I know how you feel. He's spoken to me in other ways as well. Sometimes what I believe is in miraculous ways. After a very tough period of time in the ministry, there was a point where I decided I was done. Didn't want any more of it. Pack it in. I'm moving somewhere else to do other things that are far less painful than being a pastor. And so I opened up my resume and I started to update it. I was about halfway through when I received a phone call. The person on the other end of the line simply said this: God told me to read you this portion of Scripture from 1 Chronicles 11. Eleazar, son of Dodai the Ahohite, was one of 3 mighty men. He was with David at Pasdammim when the Philistines gathered there for battle. At a place there was a field full of barley. The troops fled from the Philistines. But they took their stand in the middle of the field. They defended it and struck the Philistines down, and the Lord brought about a great victory. Okay, he said, I'm with you in this fight. God tells you to stand your ground, stay in the field, keep fighting. God will defend you. He'll win the battle. Don't give up. Then he hung up. I think that was a direct message from God saying, stay in the ministry, turn off the resume. And I did. I closed it, and I didn't open it again. So I believe God still speaks today. Sometimes in very ordinary ways, right in your heart. Sometimes just out of the blue, miraculous ways. If we're ready to listen. Last point I would make comes from verse 11. And the Lord said to Samuel, see, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears it tingle. My final point is this. Don't put words in God's mouth. Or to say it another way, let God talk and then do what He says. See, don't add a bunch of your own stuff to it and twist it with some worldly wisdom and then tie it up with your own fears and then brand it with some of your favorite theological insights. Just listen and then do what He says. The first message God gave to the boy Samuel was a really difficult one to give. He had to tell Eli that his entire family was cursed and that they would no longer be allowed to be priests. Verse 18 says that Samuel told Eli everything, hiding nothing from him. It's a tough first message for a kid to deliver to the prophet of God, the priest of the nation of Israel, the one who's been raising him since he was a toddler. But it says that Samuel delivered the message unvarnished. So in the same way, be careful not to add or subtract from what God is saying to you. If He says, turn off the electronic devices for a while, don't adjust that to, except for the news or when the playoff's on, except for my cell phone and occasionally checking my email. But besides that, if God shows you a sin in your life and He tells you to stop, don't rephrase that to being when you feel better and stronger, when you're in a better place, and then consider quitting that little habit of yours. That's not what He said. If God, through Scripture or through a person or through a message, through a sermon, whatever, if He speaks to you, don't rephrase it and edit it for content, restate it to be more politically correct, or argue with it. The Nike used to say, just do it. We all want a message from God spoken to us. But the question I have is, how many of us are willing to listen and obey? Most of us just want to hear our own voice.